I've got some handy tips on simple ways to improve your photography. Most of it can apply to you whether you use a point and shoot camera, a fancy SLR, or even just your phone. I'll be using some photographs, some of the amazing places I've been lucky enough to visit all over the world, but these tips will be useful even if you only take shots of nearby woods or lakes or your local supermarket. Some tips are for beginners, but even a fairly experienced photographer might pick up a thing or two, so watch on. So the very simplest tip, if you go no further, is how to avoid your subject being a dark shape in the foreground. If you've got a camera that's set on auto, it usually works by judging the exposure as you press the shutter. If there's lots of sky or even one bit of really bright sky, this means your subject is going to be too dark. So simply point the camera just at the foreground without including the sky. Gently squeeze the shutter halfway till you hear it beep or whatever it does. Tilt it back up to compose your shot and then fully squeeze. It is true that you can bring out the shadow detail and keep the sky nice and blue, but this tutorial is aimed at those without fancy editing software. So this works for all sorts of situations when there's a great contrast in the exposure range within the shot. Half squeeze at the bit you're most interested in and swing the camera around. And of course, if the sky is the main bit you're interested in, then do the opposite and expose for that, then tilt it down again to include a now nicely silhouetted foreground instead of the auto exposure trying to create a happy medium and thus pleasing nobody. The next easy thing is to fill the shot. Sounds obvious, but I see lots of photos where the subject fills just part of it and there's lots of wasted space doing nothing and often distracting from the main subject. And now of course I'm going to contradict that and say not always. In fact, these are just tips and not rules, and anyway, rules are meant to be broken. So there are times when that space isn't wasted. If you're leaving space there to say something like about isolation or a lack of relationship to the surrounding environment or whatever, then it's not wasted. A close-up of this guy doesn't really capture the sleepy emptiness of his surroundings, for instance. There's a lot of wasted space in theory on this photo, but it sums up the vast emptiness of the salt lake and the puniness of the Jeep zooming insignificantly across it. Yes, there is a Jeep there, look closely. Talking of cropping, I often see photos that could really benefit from it. You might think that it makes no difference. Yeah, that river in the foreground is doing nothing much and the sky's a bit boring, but I'll just ignore them. But your eye can't ignore them, and it distracts you from the overall effect of the scene. So a simple crop works wonders at making the image much more powerful. Same with these shots. Cropping out the surrounding clutter helps to really focus on this group shot of porters taking a rest. Of course, you might like to keep the background to add the atmosphere. Show a bit more about where the scene is set. But that's what a lot of photography is about, what it means to you, your preference, and it might be totally different to the next person looking at the same shot. We like frames, that's why we put pictures in them. Anyway, the same applies to a scene in a photograph. If we can find something to frame it with, trees, archways, then it looks much better than without. I see so many people at tourist spots just pick up the camera as soon as they get there and take the photo. To me, it's worth a bit of time sussing out the best spots to take it from. In this shot, there's a crane in the background I didn't like, so I tried standing in a few different places which all greatly changed the scene. I also waited till most of the people had gone, which comes up in the next tip. This fountain shot is a bit bland. Move a few feet to the side and it gets more interesting and more depth. Most of these statues in this cheery family park stand out nicely against the trees, except for the one on the far right. Move a little bit, just a little bit, and it stands out nicely against a patch of sky. Sometimes moving literally just a few inches can make a difference. Try lowering yourself, raising yourself, getting that annoying tree or power cable or confusing background out of the way. If you've got a bit more energy and dedication to the pursuit of the perfect photograph, then your work will really benefit. The Golden Gate Bridge is another example of being rewarded for your effort. Coaches pull up every few minutes and everyone clambers out to get the same viewpoint as millions of other people have done. It's a bit of a climb down to the bottom and up again, but it gives a different kind of shot, and that brings us neatly into the next tip. As I climbed down the bank, I could see fairly big splashes happening now and again. So I figured it was worth waiting a while, and after a few minutes was rewarded with a much more dramatic shot. Waiting for the right moment can apply to lots of photos. This woman was carrying a large piece of shark on her head, and I waited for her to pass this spot because I knew it would be a bit less cluttered. Sometimes the weather can be important to a shot, and it's worth waiting for the exact moment when the cloud is just at the right place as it drifts across the sky. Or the sun that's been in and out of a stormy sky all day comes back out and lights up the world in that special way that's a gift to any photographer with a bit of patience. In fact, the bad weather that might deter most from venturing out is often the time you should be getting your camera bag out. Timing also covers when you decide to take your shots. It doesn't all have to be left to chance. I've often looked at the map and worked out a sightseeing route which factors in the time of day. So for instance, I know the best time to go to avoid certain buildings being in shadow. At midday or the light directly behind you is often flat, as the sun picks out not much detail and texture. This shot would have been flat and nowhere near as interesting if the light hadn't been at an angle creating depth and side light. And side light is best for detail, such as temple carvings, which means it might be best to go nearer to sunset or just after sunrise. As a night owl, it pains me to say this, but early morning really is often the best time, especially with major tourist sites. The earliest I've got up in my life has been to arrive before the tourist hordes roll up and ruin the atmosphere. So if you're on holiday, try and make your own way there, rather than the trips they arrange for you. If you can get there the night before and stay close to it, that's ideal, even if it means sleeping in the desert. And early mornings mean you often get the bonus of a magical mist. Even if you're somewhere at the wrong time for the lighting, then maybe it's worth coming back another time and retaking the shot. I knew the sun would move in a couple of hours to the right place and greatly improve this shot. I knew that if I went back in the afternoon, the sun would be shining on this statue. The golden hour is a well-known photographer's paradise, where even the mundane can look magical. Sometimes this last hour or two before sunset can produce photographs you just wouldn't bother with at any other time of day. Best time for night shots is what you could call the blue hour. Taken too late, the sky is just black and empty, but just after sundown, there's still a wonderful blue lingering in there that contrasts nicely against orange street lamps. There's still some detail left in the buildings that aren't floodlit. You'll also see the clouds better, which makes the sky more interesting. Sometimes a shot needs a sense of scale to really hammer home the point you're trying to make, like how big that cliff is or how desolate those mountains. Hopefully you're viewing this on a decent screen and you'll be able to see the minuscule people on the bottom left of the snowfield. So if you can include a point of reference that we understand to give it a sense of scale, that always looks good. More often, a focal point is used to cement a kind of okay shot and strengthen it with something more of interest that we can relate to. People, an animal, an interestingly shaped tree, even just a rock. You'll notice this shot also involved timing again. All of them just seal the deal on an otherwise slightly too empty shot. This shot gives a focal point as well as balance, literally, and composition. The eye follows the lines of the boulder to the people. The line from the angle of the bodies goes down to the rocks, then follows them back around, keeping your eye in the shot. Which takes us to our next tip, composition. Once again, there's lines going on that keep your eye moving nicely within the picture, almost like it was planned. The girls on the rock act to keep the eye from leaving the shot, whilst the outstretched arms of the boy are an almost perfect angle to direct you to the next set of lines that take you back to the rock. In a way, composition is the hardest thing to learn, but there are rules that can help you. It's the most basic, but the rule of thirds is a safe guide. It might seem that smack bang in the centre is the best place for your subject, but that's often not true. So around these spots are good for placing your main subject. Composition is also about leading the eye into the shot. A path, a wall, a river, a coastline, all sorts of things can lead the eye in. And the trick is to get the eye to stay there. This tree was included into the picture not only to balance the towering cliff face, but it also stops the eye going out the picture and points it back up again. If you really want to understand composition, you should look at some paintings by the old masters. Some of their works are perfect showcases of the subject. Sometimes we get lucky and just have to snap up a good composition handed to us on a plate. This orangutan came crashing towards me through the trees in Sumatra, and everything about it is spot on. The way the diagonal limbs all carry your eye to the face. Which brings us to another tip, diagonals. As well as helping to keep the eye in the photo, these are a brilliant way of conveying dynamic action and conflict. Look back at old comics and they understood that. Look at Soviet art and they totally understood it. Sometimes this occurs naturally and sometimes you create it yourself by simply tilting the camera for dramatic effects. Balance is maybe even harder to understand, but in a nutshell a photo can look wrong, though you might not realise it's simply because it's not balanced. You can create this by looking for natural balance, or you can wait for the right moment, or you can move your viewpoint. As humans, a fellow human is our main point of interest, so a small figure in the shot will balance a large building or a tree or a mountain. A small building will balance a large heap of ruined walls or a mountain, or a large ornate lamppost. We're not looking for perfect balance. It's not a pair of scales where we need exactly equal matchingness. It's just a feeling of rightness we can look for sometimes or create in the shot. An example is this shot. Everything of interest is piled onto the left side. By waiting for the man to move onto the right side, it balances better. Same with this shot, where I moved into a place to make the cow in a more balanced location. If things are moving, they seem natural if there's more space in front of them to move to rather than vice versa. They also seem more natural if they're moving left to right, and I guess it's because it's the way we read. Be interested to know if the opposite applies to those who read traditional Oriental script. Sometimes you have to decide on the shutter speed. Do you want the motion blurry, like this slow shutter speed, to create a soft flowing effect? Or are you going to go for a frozen moment and a fast shutter speed? A little blur helps to capture movement. If this was totally sharp, the bus could look like it was stationary, rather than speeding along with the busboys shouting for passengers, as they do in Indonesia. Sometimes lens choice is obvious. If something is small and up a tree, we use a zoom. If we can't back off far enough away to get something all in, like this stilt village in Brunei, we use a wide angle. But lens choice is more creative than that. A lens can dramatically change the relationship of background and foreground, so using a telephoto lens brings forward the background, making mountains, for instance, loom up large and dramatically. These shots illustrate the vast difference a lens can make. The first is a wide-angle lens, then standard, then telephoto. I've moved myself further and further back to keep the main subject the same size throughout. The next three show the same in reverse. The KFC sign and the nasty buildings spoil the shot a bit for me, so moving closer in and shading to wide angle pushes the background away, making it less distracting. A telephoto also really compresses distance, so it's good for reinforcing the effect of shots like this. It also helps to blur the background, so it's less distracting, great for portraits or wildlife or anything intricate. It also has the added benefit of compressing facial features in a flattering way when it comes to portraits. Using a wide angle has the opposite effect, and this can help to really lead the eye into a shot and make you feel you're right there, perched on the edge of a landscape. And if you want as much as possible to be in focus, from the snow-capped mountains in the background to the footprint in the foreground, then a wide-angle lens will help to do that. Not everybody wants to lug a tripod around the world with them, but personally I'd rather have this slightly fuzzy shot caused by me making my own tripod with my arms braced on a tabletop, rather than this one with the flash destroying the atmosphere. Same with this nice study of two young Buddhists at their studies. The lighting is warm and from the side, whereas a flash would have destroyed that. And of course, when it comes to fire shows. And that's all, folks. Hope you've picked up a few tips. Bye bye.